Welcome to PovPolPodcast, where we discuss a variety of current events and issues locally, provincially, nationally, and abroad about poverty or from a poverty lens. PovPolPodcast is proudly produced in Calgary, Alberta, on Treaty 7 land, and we acknowledge the land, traditions, history, and the people of our First Nations, Métis, and Inuit neighbors who reside here. Hello, my name is Nigel Kirk, and I am the host of PovPolPodcast. Some good news, I'm actually learning post-production stuff. So, hopefully, over the next couple of episodes, you'll notice a marked improvement. I'm going to be re-recording the intro and the outro for next episode, so that way you'll get a much better listening experience, and even then, this episode should go a lot more smoothly for all of our listeners. I'd also like to give a shout out because we are now officially on Google Podcasts as well as on YouTube. And I'm still working on getting us on iTunes and SoundCloud. Been having some difficulty with iTunes and trying to get the logo right because they need the logo in a very specific readability format. And while I have it in the proper format, it's a PNG file, but I could convert it to a JPEG. I'm having difficulties with the protocols required for Apple to access the image on my website, so I might start having to look at hosting services, and hosting services cost a lot of money, so I'm going to give a shout out to the KO-FI coffee. And as well, we are going to be working on getting onto SoundCloud as well, I think I had mentioned as well. So we're going to work on that, but in the meantime, you can still listen to us on YouTube, or you can listen to us on Google Podcasts. We've got a nice day for you. It's a few interesting topics. We're going to be discussing hostile design, which we revisited earlier, but this time it's with a little bit more information. This was brought to my attention by a listener named Blaine. He lives in Winnipeg. He's actually a really good friend of mine as well. We go way back, so it's nice to hear from him and his involvement in this. So a huge shout out to Blaine. We're also going to be discussing universal basic income and an argument for why businesses should be supporting it. And then we're going to close off with a bit of an overview on standpoint theory. So this isn't going to be a current event one. This is going to be a contemporary philosophy and how it works. So we'll get into that when we get to it. And then, of course, we've got our lightning round, which is just 5 topics that I'll probably be going through at about maybe 3 minutes per topic on that one. And I'm looking forward to jumping into today's show with you. So let's get started. Our first topic for our first segment is going to be on hostile design and tent cities. This comes, as I mentioned earlier, from my old friend Blaine from Winnipeg. And a bit of a funny thing, I actually had the chance to go to Winnipeg a few years ago for the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness Conference. And while I was there, I got to touch base with a couple of my old friends who used to live here in Calgary, Jeff and Blaine, who live just outside of Winnipeg now. And it was really great to touch base on them. I miss you guys. I love you guys. So shout out to Jeff and Blaine on this one. And so Blaine was telling me that they did a pilot project in Winnipeg where they started putting speakers underneath the bridges to make a lot of noise to discourage people who are homeless from sleeping under bridges. And that's actually a huge concern to me. He said that the pilot project failed. It didn't work. But these are things that do happen. We see it in the UK where they put spikes to keep people from sleeping in certain areas, or some kind of special lighting that makes it very difficult to sleep under. Unlike, say, dark light or blue light, that's supposed to be easier on the eyes if you're trying to go to sleep. And this is a huge concern to me because what it was is they essentially did a pilot project on hostile design. Usually when we think of hostile design, we think of the spikes, we think of gates. I'd mentioned certain art pieces downtown here in Calgary designed to keep people from sleeping on grates. But this was a noise one designed to make sure that people don't sleep under there. Now, I don't know all the situation in Winnipeg. Blaine says that it's not uncommon for people to sleep under bridges in Winnipeg and that there are tent cities in various portions of it. And that's very different than what we have here in Calgary. I've also been hearing from friends in Vancouver where when they have tent cities, they're like actual tent cities, up to 1,000 in population in some of them, especially in the States. I don't know how big they get in Vancouver. But in Calgary, we don't really have that. There was a huge police crackdown a couple decades ago on what was known as the Tent Village. And it essentially scattered a large chunk of Calgary's vulnerable population all across the city. So now instead of having tenters congregate in one area where they can look after each other, protect each other, provide services to each other, and have service providers find them with ease, we now have people who are tenting in Bowness, in Shoaldice, Dale Hodges. There's tenters over in Franklin, in the middle of the warehouse and industrial district. There's tenters out in Foothills Industrial. They've been scattered to the edges of the city. And so this makes it more difficult for service providers to find them, because they might be in the same place for a week or two and then they get caught and then they have to move. This also makes it more difficult for them to get a foot up because they're always trying to make sure that they can find someplace safe, because there's not that safe place for them outside of the shelters. And a lot of people don't feel safe in shelters. I know I've gone to my fair share of fights in the shelters, and I'm not a confrontational person. I don't like confrontation, but even I've gotten into fights in the shelters. So a lot of people do look for tenting as a safety issue. They also want to be with a community. It's not like tenters are trying to avoid a community, but they want a community where they can set their rules, they can set their safety, they can set their boundaries, and as a community, they enforce their boundaries. Everyone works together. Everyone is on the same page. It's a collective. It's kind of like a commune. So, back to it. We don't have a lot of that in Calgary, and I haven't heard much about lights under bridges specifically to discourage the homeless from sleeping under it. Part of the reason is in a lot of the areas in Calgary where we have bridges, we also have a river that's really close to the mountains, so that water level runs really high. So it's already not very safe to be under bridges during a lot of the time in Calgary. Even if we're not getting a flood, that risk is there. So a lot of the areas under bridges are closed down by default. Secondly, even though we don't have, say, a vibrant nightlife, you're not going to find people setting up for a 24/7 camp under there, because there's going to be people who see them. A lot of the tenters here in Calgary want to do things unobstructed, and that means they've got to kind of stay hidden. So they're not going to be under an area where a lot of people are going to see them even during the day. And so we don't really have a lot of that here in Calgary that we have to worry about. And I say worry about as in the city has to worry about, because I personally have nothing against tenters. Actually, I should see if I can get him to appear on my podcast. I've got a neighbor who does landscaping, and he's actually working for a company that has a contract with the city of Calgary. And rather than evicting tenters like a lot of the other landscapers do, he actually pays them weekly to keep their area clean. So that way it's less work for him and the tenters get compensated. And it's great. He's a nice guy. If he'd be allowed to talk about this on the podcast, I'm going to see if I can get him to come on at some point. But yeah, they're not in populated areas here, so I don't see Calgary setting that up. What has been set up in Calgary, though, especially around business districts, is specific noise devices that create a sound that only people under a certain age can hear. And I don't know how they determine that, if it's biologically or if it's something about how the brain interprets things or if it's something about how the eardrum's designed. Because you could have like a 25-year-old person, but they only have the physical body of a 17-year-old. And I'm not talking like trans ageism or whatever people are calling it now. I think it's a stupid term. I think it's kind of insulting to members of the transgender community, but I don't know what the proper term is that these right-wing nut jobs are accusing of being the new thing. But I do know that people mature and age differently, both mentally and physically. So I'm wondering how they determine that under a certain age you can hear it if, someone's body is developing a little bit more slowly. That said, what it does is it gives a frequency that only people under a certain age can hear it. And it can be painful. Like at first it's just annoying, but it can lead to migraines. It can lead to other pain and probably mental health issues, if you have like an annoying sound around you wherever you go. So I definitely think, and I think I may have actually talked about that in a previous podcast, so we've got to stop doing that. That is still hostile design. And again, hostile design is bad. It doesn't matter what you're targeting. Hostile design is bad. It is not the city's job to say certain members of the population should only be in certain areas and then punish them out, especially when there are no other areas for them to legally go. So you just kind of scatter them and have this diaspora of members of the homeless community who happen to be rough sleepers. So as far as I know, we don't have any projects like that cooking here in Calgary. I'm glad that the project in Winnipeg failed. I'm glad that they're not going through with it. And I would like to take this time to say that I hope all of the members of the homeless community in Winnipeg are safe, have access to the services that they need, and have a community that supports them. Whether it's a community of social workers that wrap around and support them, or whether it's a community of other fellows on the streets who are all supporting one another. But I just hope you're all safe, and I'm glad that this project didn't go through, and stay safe, everyone. Our next topic today, and oh boy, this one is going to be fun because I talk about this a lot, and I know there's a lot of organizations in Calgary who are supporting this work in universal basic income. And everyone knows that I am a huge supporter of universal basic income. And what I'm saying here isn't going to be exactly my view. It's just going to be an argument for it because in the end goal is universal basic income and how it goes about and what the arguments are for it. And I'll briefly start with my view, and that is that it should be businesses' responsibilities to pay their employees a living wage. I absolutely believe that. And it's not the job of the government to subsidize businesses who don't want to pay a living wage. That being said, a good argument for universal basic income is that it puts less burden on businesses to fill that role. And I honestly think that it's a pretty conservative idea because it's universal. It goes to everyone. It goes to all citizens. It doesn't just go to the poor citizens. It goes to all of the citizens. Granted, the more money you make, the less of a top-up you'll get. If you're making $1 million, you might get, like, say, a $500 rebate on your taxes for that. But for people who are under, they'll get a much larger rebate. That's what's known as the negative income tax. It operates similar to GST, where you'd be given a monthly or once every 3 months stipend. That would be part of an income tax rebate. And that's what's called as the negative income tax. And it was tested in Manitoba back in the 70s. And it saw a lot of positive effects. Chief among them, because there's not much reporting on it, so you have to go through old news articles from that time, because the pilot project wasn't even complete at the time that it was canceled. So you'll have to go through news reports at the time. And one of the things that was found was that students were graduating high school at a much larger rate because they weren't being pressured to drop out of school to help support their families who were in low income. And granted, the 1970s were a very different time than the 2020s. So we don't see as much pressure for children to drop out of school and support their families. The pressure is still there, though. What this also means is that children aren't going to be, even if it's just for personal reasons, so they can save up for video games or whatever, children aren't going to be pressured to get a job at the age of 16 and try and plow through high school at the same time. They can focus more efforts on studying. They can focus more efforts on playing. They can join a sports team. They can do more volunteer work. Possibilities are endless. So universal basic income definitely will help the youth. Back to the argument about businesses, though, and why businesses should support it. Even though, as I've already said, I don't think it's the government's job to subsidize businesses who don't want to pay employees a proper wage. I believe if you are working, you should be able to meet your needs. This isn't the same as like welfare or Alberta Works, which most people know that I'm a recipient of Alberta Works. So I understand that because I am not working currently, quote unquote, I am not entitled to those same kind of benefits. But I think everyone who is working should have their needs met. And if businesses aren't going to step up and do it, then a negative income tax can fill that gap. And I really think that that can be a boon to businesses on a couple of fronts. Number one, instead of just subsidizing businesses to create more jobs and then having those businesses close shop and move to the States, because, I'm a firm believer that a job creation tax cut should be tied to creating jobs. It also means that there's going to be more people spending money. It's like a stimulus of some sort. This money is going to be spent at places in most cases. I don't know the exact stats. I will have to look them up. But there are definitely more people below a certain income than above a certain income. In fact, if you want to be considered one of the top 1% wealthiest Canadians, you only need to be making $190,000. Now, that's a lot of money to me, but it doesn't sound like a lot when you think of what a successful, wealthy person makes. But that is the top 1% of income earnings in Canada, is if you're in $190,000 or higher, you're in that top 1%. Which means the vast majority of Canadians, I think, are actually probably closer to being poor than they are to being wealthy. Because I don't even think that top 1% is wealthy. You have to be in like the top 0.1%. That said, if we give money, even to people who are earning that $190,000 per year, and we gave them a negative income tax receipt of, say, $2,000, I think someone earning that much is probably going to spend at least some of that $2,000. But I think the majority of us are going to be in that $50,000 or lower range. We'll probably get a larger receipt, and especially those of us who are working but earning less than $24,000 per year, we're going to be given the largest rebates. And that is going to result in a lot of spending. So that is good for businesses. And on the flip side, instead of just continually cutting the corporate tax, what we can then do is, and I don't like this because, again, I think businesses do have a responsibility to ensure that their workers can at least meet their basic needs. But instead of just constantly giving tax cuts to businesses, we can say, okay, we've got this basic income program, so we will put a pause on discussions involving increasing the minimum wage because the government is meeting the needs of their employees. Now, I'm not going to say lower minimum wage. Absolutely not. That is where I draw the line as an absolute hard no. But then the pressure is not on the businesses to increase the minimum wage so frequently and to offer those raises all the time. I do think that they should at least still offer benefits. But if this person's needs are going to be met, then that takes a bit of pressure off of businesses. I think that there are going to be a lot of businesses who are still going to make sure that they pay a living wage, or going to continue to be living wage leaders. But ultimately, this takes some of the pressure off of them. It doesn't take all the pressure. Like I said, businesses have a responsibility, but this will take some of the pressure off of them. Their employees are going to be happier because they are having their needs met. Productivity is going to go up among the working population. So I absolutely think that it's actually a pretty conservative idea to introduce universal basic income. It's a very, very pro-business thing to do. It puts money back in the hands of the people. It gives them purchasing power. Nothing is more democratic than purchasing power. Nothing is more democratic than being able to choose where you spend your money on and what you spend your money on. And we say everyone has that choice, but I shop at Walmart because it is literally the only place I can afford that I can go in there with $100 and come out with enough food to feed myself for the next 2 to 3 weeks. So I think nothing is more democratic than giving people that purchasing power. Businesses will have a little bit of pressure taken off of them to meet the demand of the laboring and working class. And finally, will also funnel back into businesses, because if businesses are doing the things that they should be doing in a democratic society, people are going to want to spend their money there. And when these people have money to spend, they are going to spend it. So that is actually one of the reasons why libertarians are huge supporters of some form of basic income. Now, they don't do standard universal basic income, and there's different models for universal basic income, and libertarians subscribe specifically to one model where it's used to replace social services. But that's a topic for another time. Ultimately, there is a reason why many libertarians are starting to come on board on universal basic income. And I think that it would behoove businesses to look into politicians and organizations and volunteer groups and nonprofits that are pushing the argument for a universal basic income, and maybe attend some of these conversations, see how it goes, learn a little bit from them, have this discussion, and support it. Because I think it's actually, in the long run, beneficial to all of society, whether it be the working class, whether it be those on social assistance, whether it be those who are business owners, job creators. And yeah, I don't know what else I can say about that. It's actually not a liberal idea. Universal basic income is not a liberal idea. It's actually a fairly conservative one. And I think that it will actually also result in less spending in the hospital system, less spending in the jail system, less spending in the shelter system. Ultimately, I think it would save a lot of money as well as funnel money back into job creators. So there we go. That's one way of diversifying the economy, is investing directly in the people. Finally, we're going to go into a bit of an overview of standpoint theory. Now, standpoint theory has been a huge game changer for me. I am absolutely obsessed with this, and given an opportunity, I will not shut up about it. Now, standpoint theory actually stems from feminist dialogue, as specifically one of the most notable advocates for standpoint theory is Sandra Harding, who is a feminist educator in the States. And here's how standpoint theory kind of works. It's used as an analogy tool. So close your eyes for just a second. Unless you're driving. If you're listening to this in the car or walking down the streets, pay attention to what's going on around you. But if you're at home or somewhere quiet and somewhere where you're not going to get injured if you close your eyes, close your eyes. Picture a circle. In that center of that circle is a dot. We will call that the primary standpoint. The circle is society. So you're picturing your head, you're picturing a circle, that circle represents society, and the primary standpoint, a dot in the absolute perfect center of that circle, is the person who has the most privilege in that society. Someone who has all the benefits of society. So in most Eurocentric countries, such as Canada, the States, the United Kingdom, France, that circle is the society, and that dot would be, say, a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant or Catholic, if you're, say, in France or Quebec, heterosexual, male, middle class. So there's all of those various viewpoints. And there are other, of course, minority and majority groups that will affect the privilege, but that is someone who is the primary, someone who has the most privilege in society. Now, if that dot represents that person, let's draw a triangle from that point to the edges. That triangle represents what that person can see in society. That represents how much of society they can view. So if you've ever looked at security camera mapping plans, if you've ever played, say, Metal Gear Solid or anything like that, there is a range of vision. So this triangle is going to represent the range of vision of that person for what they can see in society. It's not very much. It's probably only going to be about 1/5 of the circle. If they've got good side vision, they might be able to see 1/4 of the circle, but they're not going to see more than that. Now, we are going to draw other dots on that circle. Let's move out of the circle a little bit. Because now, instead of having a white, middle-class, heterosexual, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant or Catholic, cisgendered male in the center, we're going to make it a black male. That's going to be moved a little bit further out. Or we can make it an indigenous woman, and that gets moved even further out. Basically, when you're looking at this mental image, the more identifiers they have that keep them away from the dominance in society, the decision makers, the ideals, the primes, the closer to the margins of the circle they become. This is what we call marginalization. It's very literal. Like, this is an analogy, but this is why we use the term marginalized to describe people who are in poverty, to describe women, to describe racial minorities, the indigenous, African Americans, blacks, Latinos. And then let's say we make that person gay. We move them even closer to the margins. They're a single mother. We move them even closer to the margins. They're a single mother who's only earning $20,000 a year, even closer to the margins. So now let's take someone who's much closer to the margins now. That last person that we did that was really close to the margins. Let's talk about that person. They turn around and they face the same direction that the person in the center is facing. We're going to assume that they were moving backwards, directly backwards each time. They can see a lot more of that circle. They turn around and they take a look at the circle. They can see a lot more of that circle that represents society. The argument is, for standpoint theory, and this is the argument that standpoint theory tries to make, and granted, it's just an analogy, really, but it's a very appropriate one, is that the closer you are to the margins of society, the better position you're in to view society's flaws objectively. Now, you could view them completely subjectively. You can view it strictly within your own little bubble, but you can see more of society. You can see more of what's going on. And you're in a much better position to view and critique society's flaws than that perfect person in the center that society tends to treat really well. And I want to be very clear here. There are people who are in that center who fall through the cracks. So I don't want to say that society absolutely protects that person in the center, but society tends to protect that person in the center, where society tends to ignore the person in the margins. Because as we said, we move that dot strictly backwards from where the person was standing and looking. So that person in the center isn't even seeing that person in the margins. But that person in the margins can see the person in the center and can see a whole lot of the other areas in society as well. And so that's how standpoint theory works. Standpoint theory tries to illustrate, in a very literal sense, how marginalization works and why we need to look to people who are marginalized as leaders for societal improvement. Now, that doesn't mean we need to expect them to be teachers. It is up to us to do the work and learn. Now, I'm always willing to talk about my time on the streets. I'm always willing to talk about homelessness. I'm always willing to talk about the police brutality I experienced while I was homeless. I'm always willing to talk about the friendships I formed while I was homeless. I'm always willing to talk about being spat on by people while panhandling and having my busking materials stolen and all that stuff. I'm always willing to talk about my experiences. But even then, I don't usually do it for free. Unless I'm making an appearance before city council, I usually expect compensation from private entities. But I'm not obliged to do on any of those things. It is up to people to do the work to learn. But in order for them to learn, some people do need to leave a record for them to study. Back to standpoint theory, though. Just the quick bullet points now, because I've gone through it. So remember, the circle represents society. Where you are in the circle determines how much society tends to protect you. The closer you are to the center of the circle, the more society is systemically designed to benefit you. The closer to the margins you are in that circle, the less society is inclined to benefit and protect you. This is what we call marginalization. Where you are on the circle is going to be different for where you reside geographically as well. And the reason why I say that is because there are some cities that do good to take care of their homeless and work hard to make sure that the homeless aren't left behind and can participate in society and can get housed. And then there are other places that don't do that very well at all. So someone who's homeless in one circle might be further away from the center than, say, someone who's homeless in another circle. So the quick bullet points is society is a circle. Where you're located in the circle determines how marginalized or not marginalized you are. Different circles will move different identities closer to the margins or closer to the center. And the closer you are to the margins, the better position you are to view society and its flaws more objectively. That is standpoint theory in a nutshell. Okay, finally, we are going to go on to the lightning round. I have 5 topics in front of me. I'm going to talk about them briefly, just about 3 minutes max each, hopefully. So here we go. First lightning round topic, stampede. I am so glad that my city's population has not doubled this year. I understand the stampede is very good for the economy. It brings in a lot of tourists. And yes, I miss all of the free pancake breakfasts, and I'm missing the opportunity to go down and have some very exotic food. But on my budget, I likely wouldn't be able to afford that anyways. But you know what I don't miss? I don't miss looking up in the newspapers and reading about all of the sexual harassment that's going on. I don't miss talking to my friends on the streets and hearing that, oh yeah, the police came and they threw me into the cell for 10 days because my warrants had built up and they didn't want to do anything about it until Stampede came. I'm not missing hearing about my friends being beat up by police. Now the police officers can't issue warrants for minor offenses, but they can still issue promises to appear. I don't miss the crowds. I'm not very good in crowds. I love an audience. I don't like crowds. So there's a whole bunch of things that I don't miss during Stampede. I also don't miss opening up a newspaper and reading about how another horse had to be put down because it got into a chuck wagon accident. I understand the Stampede is very, very good for the economy, but I think we've seen this year what happens without the Stampede, and I actually am kind of okay with less sexual harassment, less police officers bullying marginalized communities, less animals being killed for entertainment purposes and purely entertainment purposes. So yeah, I think I'm good on that. The next topic I have here is all lives matter. Okay, all lives matter is the stupidest thing ever. I want to be very, very clear about that. It is very, very, very stupid. Because for starters, to the all lives matter crowd, I want to be very, very clear. They don't care about all lives. They only care about making sure they can still oppress black people. You want to know the evidence of this? In Edmonton, recently, a man who identifies as having African, Indigenous, and other ancestries was brutally beaten by the police. But when you look at the guy's photo, the guy is very, very Caucasian appearing. He's a very, very white appearing individual. I'm not going to question his history. I'm not going to question his identity. I'm just making that observation. He was brutally assaulted by 6 police officers in a Mac store in Edmonton over a mistake that the officers had made. Not him, that the officers had made. And then when a white guy started filming, they then interfered with the white guy's ability to film and then threatened the white guy, took his phone away, which officers are not allowed to do. But when you've got a guy with a gun, namely the police officer, realistically, he can do whatever he wants, even though whether he's allowed to or not, no one's going to stop him. He then took the guy's camera away, and this was a white guy who was filming it, and then arrested him for filming. And then they charged him with obstruction of justice, I believe it was. So that's 2 white folks, or what would look to an outsider as 2 white folks, being arrested by the police officers, one of them absolutely brutally beaten. And you want to know something? The All Lives Matter crowd, they haven't talked about it at all. They are ignoring it. They are ignoring police brutality against everyone. They are ignoring police brutality against blacks. They are ignoring police brutality against whites. They are ignoring police brutality against anyone. You know who has been talking about it, though? Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter and Black and Indigenous Lives Matter. Those 2 groups have been talking about it a lot. They are not just standing up strictly for Black lives, even though it is primarily about the focus on systemic racism against Blacks and Indigenous people. They recognize that other people fall through the cracks in this broken system, and they are standing up for them. But the All Lives Matter crowd, they're not. They're not talking about this at all. They just want to bitch about black people. So that is why I'm going to reaffirm that I think all lives matter is the absolute dumbest thing in the world. Because clearly they're not for all lives mattering. Because they're not bringing attention to the similar crimes against non-blacks. But blacks and Black Lives Matter, they absolutely are bringing attention to these things because they understand it's a systemic problem, and that while it disproportionately affects blacks, they do recognize that it does affect other people as well. So I want to just take the time to thank my friends of color for talking about this. And then on a similar matter, colorblindness. This was a term that was popularized by Stephen Colbert back when he was doing the Colbert Show, where he would satirically portray a right-wing news pundit. And he would often say, "I don't see color." The reason why I'm bringing this up is because I have quite a few friends who love to say, "I don't see color," or "I'm colorblind." And I'm going to tell you straight up, and this is the same thing I've told them, that's got to be bogus and that they have to see color. And the reason why is because almost all of these come from service providers. All of them come from groups that have taken trauma-informed care. Many of them were in my trauma-informed care class. So if you're going to claim that you don't see color, you don't see the underlying intergenerational trauma that is unique to minority groups. You don't see the people that were raised with the intergenerational trauma of residential schools. You don't see the people that were raised with the trauma of having their parents have to tell them how to interact with a police officer at the age of 6 in order to avoid being arrested. You're not seeing that. And so if you're claiming to be colorblind, you are not performing trauma-informed care properly. The two are mutually exclusive. You cannot refuse to see someone's color and someone's experiences and someone's backgrounds all tied into that, and then say you're performing trauma-informed care. Because if you're going out and you're being colorblind, so to speak, in terms of racial differences in experiences, then you are also being blind to their trauma. So you cannot be both. Pick one, pick the other, but I will say straight up, if you're going to do this whole, oh, I don't see race thing, you are not going to be capable of performing trauma-informed care. Plain and simple. Another quick one that actually has very little to do with current events or anything, but the PovPolPodcast logo. I've actually had a few people ask me about this, and in the PovPolPodcast logo, I drew it myself. I use Paint Tool Sci, and what's my tablet here? A Wacom Lumos tablet. That sound you might have heard in the microphone was the sound of me pulling my shelf out so I could take a look at my tablet. And I use Paint Tool Sci as my drawing software. And I used that to just create myself a quick logo. It took me about 20 minutes to make because I am a horrible artist and I had to edit all the line work to make it look nice. But if anyone's wondering, and I've had a few people actually ask me this specifically, what is that giant marshmallow I'm holding? Why am I holding a giant marshmallow? It's not a giant marshmallow. It's a coffee cup because I absolutely love my coffee. And a lot of the times that there's long silent pauses in this podcast, it's me drinking my coffee and forgetting to edit it out. Yummy. So that is what my logo is. The font is actually, I don't have the notes in front of me for this. I really should start creating better notes for these things. But if you were watching this on YouTube, you'll see the credit for the font in the title card. And I just decided that it'd be fun to have like an illustration of myself drinking coffee, and that would be my podcast logo. So I hope you all like it. And then this last one came to me by a random topic generator, because I am already a week and a half behind on this, and it's easier for me to come up with first segment in-depth topics than it is for me to come up with lightning round topics, because a lot of the lightning round topics I would really love to talk about for like 8 to 10 to 15 minutes. That would be much longer than I usually allot for the lightning round topics. So I decided to use a random topic generator for this one, and I thought this one was kind of funny, and I actually haven't done any prep for this. So if you had a personal mascot, what would your mascot be? And I actually think that it would probably just be an anime character version of myself. I think most of my friends who know me know that I do have an obsession with anime. I watch it a lot. I try to stay on top of new shows. I don't watch a lot of the popular shows, so don't talk to me about Dragon Ball or Gundam. I'd love to get into some of those shows one of these days, but I just haven't been able to. So I do watch a lot of new and current shows though. So I usually watch about 5 to 10 shows per season that are current as well. I try and go through my backlog list a little bit and catch up on things that I'd missed from previous seasons that I would love to enjoy watching. So yeah, I would probably just have an anime character version of myself. Make it a chibi character, kind of like childlike, cutely drawn version kind of thing. So have like a chibi character version of myself, but have all of the features and the attitude blown all over the top. It'd be me to the 11th degree. So yeah, I think if I had a personal mascot, it'd be a chibi anime style version of myself, but attitude wise dialed up to 11. So yes, once again, just a reminder, you can now find our podcast on Google Podcasts. Subscribe, really encourage that, and have a wonderful day. Thank you for listening to PovPolPodcast. I've been your host, Nigel Kirk. If you enjoy what you've heard, please subscribe on your preferred podcast platform and give us a thumbs up on YouTube or a positive rating on your listening service. Also, please consider supporting me and supporting the project on Ko-fi at ko-fi.com/PovPolPodcast. If you have topics you'd like to hear about or lightning round suggestions, please email them to PovPolPodcast@gmail.com. The music used for the podcast is Poor Boy by Pedro Santiago and is under a Creative Commons license. Hey there, YouTube audience. This is Nigel, the host of PovPolPodcast. I want to take some time here to thank you for listening. And don't forget, if you're enjoying what we're doing, to click that subscribe button, to click that thumbs up button. We'd really appreciate it. It's a great way to support us. And you should see some links showing up on your card right now with some other playlists that we're doing. So feel free to click on those and see what else we've got going on. Leave us a comment, and thanks again.